Well, thank you, Francis, and thank you, Kate, and for the invitation to be here. Eremos is one of those pieces of the religious spiritual landscape in Australia that I think is very significant and very important, and so it is lovely to be here with you to share something of that experience, that common journey today. So my title for the talk is When the Heart Cracks Open, and it was Kate who helped me to find the title, so thanks for that too. The Australian philosopher Raymond Gaita has written of an experience he had at 17 while he was working as a ward assistant at a psychiatric hospital. The patients at the hospital were judged to be incurable. Some had been there over 30 years, and Gaita says they appeared to have irretrievably lost everything which gives meaning to our lives. They had long since ceased to receive visits from friends, wives, children, and even parents. And often they were treated brutishly by the psychiatrists and nurses. A small number of psychiatrists, however, worked devotedly to improve their conditions. And they spoke against all appearances of the inalienable dignity of even these patients. And Gaita says that he admired these psychiatrists enormously. One day, a nun came to the ward, and everything in her demeanour towards the patients, Gaita writes, the way she spoke to them, her facial expressions, the inflections of her body, contrasted with and showed up the behaviour of those noble psychiatrists. She showed that they were, despite their best efforts, condescending, as I too had been. She thereby revealed that even such patients were, as the psychiatrists and I had sincerely and generously professed, the equals of those who wanted to help them. But she also revealed that in our hearts we did not believe this. And for Gaita, reflecting on this episode, what was astonishing about the nun's love for the patients was its power to reveal what their affliction had obscured, the power to reveal their full humanity and moral equality. And Gaita insists that he cannot explain how the nun's love revealed the humanity of the patients, and nor can he demonstrate that her love was justified by anything about them. What she revealed, he says, is essentially mysterious, and he is simply claimed in testimony by it. He goes on to say that there are philosophies that leave or create conceptual space for such mystery, and there are some which close that space. Most do not even see the need for it. Well, Gaita claims, and I agree with him, that attending to this kind of encounter undergirds any proper account of ethics or the moral life. And this is because ethics, in its fullest and deepest sense, is about recognising and responding to the independent reality, the mysterious otherness of another. And that is much more difficult than it seems. In the example Gaita gives, we might wonder if what made it so difficult for him and the psychiatrists to believe in their hearts that the patients were fully their equals was their psychiatric condition. The way their affliction made it hard to recognise them as sharing in our common life, a common humanity. But the issue goes deeper than that. And let me give a couple more examples. The philosopher Cora Diamond refers to a scene in Tolstoy's War and Peace, which illustrates a similar difficulty in recognising the humanity of another and its profound moral significance. In the story, Pierre is brought as a prisoner before General Davout. When Davout first looks up from his papers, he sees Pierre standing before him only as the present prisoner, the present circumstance to be dealt with. And then something in Pierre's voice makes him look at him intently. And in that moment, in Tolstoy's words, an immense number of things pass dimly through both their minds. Diamond says that Tolstoy doesn't say what things, but she thinks they may be such things as scenes of childhood, of courtship, of the death of a parent or sibling. They may be hopes and dreams, perhaps in Davout's case, those inspired many years earlier by the revolution. And in that second look, she writes, human relations between the two men are established. And it is that look which saves Pierre's life. By contrast, another prisoner tells of a different kind of look. The prisoner is Primo Levi, the Italian Jew who told of his experience of Auschwitz in an extraordinary memoir called If This Is a Man. Levi has been brought before the German supervisor of the chemistry laboratory in which he hoped to be given work and so to survive a second winter in Auschwitz. Levi writes that he was brought before Panwitz, the supervisor, who sat at his writing table. And the look that passed between them, Levi says, was not one between two men. And Levi goes on to say that if I had known how completely to explain the nature of that look, which came as if across the glass window of an aquarium between two beings who live in different worlds, I would also have explained the essence of the great insanity of the third journey. And I think what these examples suggest is that our capacity to recognise or deny fellowship with another, to recognise or deny a shared humanity, is at the heart of our moral lives. It's true that in the circumstances of much of our ordinary life, we are not conscious of the need for such deep recognition of the reality of other people. We don't need the kind of awareness and responsiveness displayed by Goethe's nun to come up with just ordinary rules of reasonably polite behaviour, to come up with pragmatic or prudential justifications for some minimal moral rules. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, or I won't hurt you if you don't hurt me, kinds of social contract. The problem is that such minimalist social contracts don't hold up under pressure. You only have to look at the collapse of any sense of a shared humanity under certain ideological or cultural conditions, and from Levi's Germany through to contemporary Iraq and Afghanistan. And where, for example, there's socially sanctioned racism or sexism. So they don't hold up under pressure. And in any case, an account of the moral life understood solely in terms of self-interested reciprocity fails entirely to register what goes deepest in our moral relationships with one another, which is our capacity to deny and refuse acknowledgement of another in ways that lacerate souls. as well as our capacity to heal and co-create each other by love. It's striking, for example, how many times in the Gospels Jesus is said to look intently at someone who asks for healing. And we see just this kind of attentive and healing responsiveness in the story of Goethe's Nun and Tolstoy's account of the mutual recognition between General Davout and Pierre. I see you, and how healing that can be. And in these examples, although I focused on human beings, of course, this same kind of attention, recognition, letting be, is the condition of our responding ethically to the independent reality of the non-human world as well. To land, animals, plants, oceans, ecosystems. Seeing and loving them for what they are in themselves, rather than simply for what they can do for us. So what makes possible this deep kind of recognition and response to the reality of others, to the reality of what is not me? Iris Murdoch, the English philosopher and novelist, says that profound and truthful seeing of what is not me involves getting free of what she calls the tissue of self-aggrandizing and consoling wishes and dreams which prevent one from seeing what is there outside one. And in another place she talks about the fat, relentless ego which needs to be got out of the way. And she calls this unselfing. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, speaks in a similar way of the need to be freed from self-oriented, acquisitive habits and the distorted understanding that comes from them. Only then, he says, will I become more free to love human beings in a human way, to love them not for what they may promise me, to love them not as if they were there to provide me with lasting safety and comfort, but as fragile fellow creatures held in the love of God. I love that phrase, fragile fellow creatures. And he goes on, I discover how to see other persons and things for what they are in relation to God, not to me. And it is here that true justice, as well as true love, has its roots. So ethics, moral practice, has to do with getting the self out of the way, in the sense of being no longer driven by the need to dominate or control the world around me. My vision no longer distorted by projections of fear or fantasy, or by compulsions to acquire or manipulate. And it's important to notice that these compulsions need not come from what we generally think of as bad moral motives. It may be precisely our anxiety to do good or to deal with our discomfort at somebody else's suffering which gets in the way of really being with who they are. Well, the problem is, I think, that aspects of our ethical and religious understanding often lead us to a distorted sense of what this call to get the self out of the way, or to unself, actually involves, and so can be self-defeating. So I want to draw a distinction between two concepts of unselfing before turning to have a look at how spiritual practice is, I believe, essential for cultivating this kind of deep moral responsiveness. Growing up, I tended to understand exhortations to leave self behind, get myself out of the way, or die to self, as calls to subordinate myself to other people and their wishes and desires. And perhaps this is familiar to some of you. Selflessness meant denial or negation of my needs and wants in favour of the other. And bound up with that was the need to repress or suppress those bits of myself that didn't quite live up to this nice, selfless self-image. Well, we're increasingly aware of how spiritually, morally, psychologically problematic this approach to life can be. Not to mention how covertly controlling and manipulative, by the way. And feminist critics have noted, for example, that calls to self-denial and self-abnegation in the Christian tradition, this is a quote from Mark McIntosh, a theologian, have usually been calls that men seem to have issued and women expected to heed. Though I certainly know plenty of nice Christian men who have been entrapped in just this same kind of vision. And this life-denying, moralistic, and ultimately violent suppression of self was brilliantly exposed by Nietzsche, who also saw its shadow side in the form of resentment and mean-spiritedness, which paradoxically keeps the frustrated and wounded self firmly at the centre of things. When unselfing is practiced as a kind of self-mutilation, disavowing my needs, desires and interests, as well as my shadow, then either I fail to become a self at all, or it remains I who am the focus of attention. I decide what's needful. I exercise my will or virtue and heroically sacrifice myself in whole or in part. I remain other to the one in need, acting out of my own resources and self-sufficiency. And no wonder at some point in many of our lives we just react against it. Well, there's a second concept of unselfing, which is not structured essentially by repression and self-denial. And this is unselfing, understood as what I call self-dispossession or self-forgetfulness. The American Trappist monk Thomas Merton fell into it one day, the day he recognised his communion with the whole human race. This is a quote. In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the centre of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realisation that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. And I suppose my happiness could have taken form in the words, thank God that I am like other men, that I am only a man among others. In this letting go of an illusory specialness, Merton says, with all the supposed renunciation that went with it. It was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts, the person that each one is in God's eyes. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time. Well, I've known a similar kind of experience, and perhaps some of you have too. I think it's actually not as uncommon as we might think. Mine too came not as a result of moral effort, but after a time of prolonged crisis in my life. I'd been teetering on the brink of what felt like a catastrophic failure, battling anxiety and a terrifying sense of being suspended over the abyss. And the prospect of this failure put me in touch with the realization that my sense of my own self and its value had been tied up with a deeply felt need to become someone. And that to justify my existence, I needed to contribute more to the world than others. For other people, it might be enough to live an ordinary life, to have an ordinary job and ambitions, but that wasn't enough for me. I had to make a difference. And stripped of the prideful sense that I was going to be capable of making that difference, my life felt unendurable and shameful. Well, my salvation came not in Louisville, but sitting on the edge of Darling Harbour in Sydney. And I realised that I was never going to be able to make myself adequate in my own eyes. But for the first time, I realised that no one apart from me was saying that I needed to be more than everyone else, just to be enough. I finally realised that I could not justify myself, and even more amazingly, that I didn't have to. I could just let myself be here. And the relief of that liberating moment was indescribable. Finally, I could relax and rejoice in being simply a human being among others. No better and no worse. Like Merton, I found myself laughing out loud, delighting in being absurdly, wonderfully, simply human. Like Merton, I awakened to a profound experience of love for others, a profound compassion for all of us, seeing how one way or another, we're all caught in the same thing. At the time, I was working in the Senate of the Australian Parliament, doing research for Senate committees. And soon after this experience, I was in a committee meeting and just overwhelmed by the wonder and beauty of a rather obnoxious senator from Western Australia. I knew it was true. As Merton wrote, as if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me, now I realise what we all are. And if only everybody could realise this. But it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. Well, the unselfing that happens in this kind of experience is not a matter of being consciously unselfish, nobly self-sacrificing. It's simply that we no longer have an ego capable of propping itself up or anxiously needing to be special and keep itself separate in order to defend or justify itself. And paradoxically, this experience of humility is precisely the moment of our becoming freely, most freely and truly who we are and who we long to be. When the illusory, frightened, false self falls away, then what is there is love. What is there is our fellowship with all that exists. And this is the reality, I think, from which authentic moral life, moral responsiveness issues. Ethics is not ideology, but ontology. It's not a good idea, it's about being. It's not the endless striving to be better than we are, but the expression of the felt reality of the interconnectedness of all life and of the love at the centre of existence. So how do we learn to live from this reality? How do we come to know it, participate in it, in our own experience? Sometimes, as in my own story, a kind of crisis precipitates an experience of being unselfed and pressed into the ground of a common humanity. We get a glimpse of a radical new possibility for being in relation. But living out of this reality consistently is a whole different thing. And all too soon, the experience of ourselves as inadequate, of others as rivals and threats, as competitors for scarce resources, as senators as basically obnoxious, that experience reasserts itself. And here it seems to me that we reach the necessary relationship between ethics and spiritual practice. Now, of course, this itself is a tricky issue. Religious belief and belonging can so easily perpetuate precisely the kind of separateness from others that makes deep mutual recognition impossible, which was in effect what Merton had been saying all these years. I've been trying to be a holy monk, and it's precisely that that's been getting in the way of seeing my relationship with other people. Time and again, religion functions in human culture to underpin what theologian James Allison has called systems of goodness. And these systems define themselves and their righteousness over against what is deemed impure, unholy, dishonourable, and wrong. The condemnation of those judged to be outside the pale can then manifest in every key, from social shunning in middle-class Anglicanism to the frenzied violence of honour killings in rural Pakistan. And here, religious belonging and righteousness operate not to enable the self to disappear, to be liberated through self-forgetful love from fear and threatenedness and the need to be justified, and instead operates precisely to keep a robust religious ego in place, better than everyone else, and licensed to condemn transgressors. So there is no necessary connection between religious practice or devotion and loving and truthful responsiveness to the reality of the other. And the idea that Sunday school is good for children's moral development may, I think, in many cases be precisely wrong. So when I say relationship between ethics and spirituality, I don't mean primarily a relationship between ethics and religious self-identification and moral conformity. I mean a particular kind of spiritual practice, one that involves the costly journey beyond the threatened, self-defended, self-sufficient self into what Thomas Merton called the hidden wholeness, the unified field where, as the mystics have taught us, we discover our communion with all things. And in my experience, and I think in the testimony of all the major religious traditions, it is a practice of contemplative prayer or meditation that most powerfully enables this kind of journey. It's a practice we find in Indigenous culture as well, and you will, I'm sure, be familiar with the teaching of Daly River elder Miriam Rose Ungulmer Bauman on Dadiri. She's written, "Dadiri is inner, deep listening and quiet, still awareness. Dadiri recognises the deep spring that is inside us. We call on it and it calls to us. This is the gift that Australia is thirsting for. It is something like what you call contemplation." And the heart of contemplative prayer, or the contemplative stance, is wordless and focused attention away from the self, away from the self's plans, anxieties, and experience. It's not about suppressing the self or fighting with the self, but simply turning our attention outwards. And such prayer is learnt through a disciplined and intentional practice, not only of silence, but of laying aside thoughts, so that the silence gradually comes to be internal as well as external. So how is this prayer transformative and liberating? It's to do, I think, with the way it both makes space for the transforming reality of the love at the heart of life, which some of us call God, and because it practices letting go of the self-made, self-justifying, separating self. The theologian Sarah Coakley is at pains to emphasise that this self-effacement is no violent expression of self-suppression or self-abnegation. But the basic contemplative insight is that at a certain point, we need to leave behind our thoughts and our self-consciousness, since these are the means by which we maintain our illusion of separateness and self-possession, and so are alienated from ourselves and from others. The Benedictine teacher of Christian meditation, John Main, acknowledged the difficulty we experience in practicing this kind of self-forgetfulness, saying, "It requires nerve to become really quiet. To learn just to say the mantra," which was his practice, "and turn away from all thought requires courage." There comes, he continues, a delicate moment in our progress when we begin to understand the totality of the commitment involved in self-surrendering prayer, when we see the total poverty involved in the mantra. This is the complete simplicity which demands not less than everything. But it is this, he says, that is the condition of our entering with our whole beings into the movement beyond the self and into the reality of love. Or to put it in the Christian idiom, it is the way we enter the dynamic of death and resurrection, receiving back our lives, ourselves, on the other side of death as gift. Surrender of our thoughts in the silence of contemplative prayer is, John Main says, the means by which we hand ourselves over and hold nothing back. Well, the great Persian poet and Sufi mystic Rumi wrote, "Out beyond ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." There's a profound and deceptive simplicity in these words. For there to be an I, capable of truly meeting you, is the fruit of a long, sometimes painful journey. I understand it as a paschal journey, where the heart cracks open. The false self is surrendered, so as to make room for others and let them be. Such a meeting can happen only in open space, in a field where there is no territory and no neurotic honour to defend, where love transforms wounds. Notice that Rumi doesn't say out beyond right doing and wrong doing, but out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing. This is not about the abandonment of justice and truth, but about detachment from the ideologies we identify with, and in the name of which we so often end up sacrificing others as well as ourselves without ever really meeting them. True justice, as Rowan Williams says, comes from seeing ourselves and others clearly, as God sees. Without this, he says, our search for justice or for peace becomes another exercise of human will, undermined by human self-deception. This is why ethics is inseparable from spiritual practice. Or, in the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, writing from his prison cell in 1944, why there is a necessary relationship between prayer and righteous action. True prayer purifies the motive, the heart. True justice is the necessary work of sharing and liberating in others the humanity we have discovered in our contemplative encounter. Out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there's a place, an unthreatened, hospitable place. A place where we hear each other into deeper speech, liberate each other for fuller life. A transforming community of love called into being. Let's meet there.